The pristine marble floors of St. Haven Elderly Care Centre reflected Richard Morrison's scowl as he stood in the entrance, his Italian leather shoes feeling oddly out of place against the institutional tiles. At 50 years old, with salt and pepper hair and a face weathered more by stress than age, he was the last person anyone would expect to find in a retirement home, especially as an employee. "Mr. Morrison, welcome to St. Haven," said Sarah Chen, the facility director, her professional smile barely masking her wariness. She had every right to be cautious. It wasn't every day that a millionaire's son was court-ordered to work in an elderly care facility as part of his rehabilitation program. Richard's jaw clenched as he remembered the judge's words. 6 months of community service or jail time, Mr. Morrison. Your choice. The DUI that had nearly killed a family of 4 had finally forced him to face consequences that his father's money couldn't make disappear. Sarah led him through the facility, her voice maintaining its practiced cheerfulness as she outlined his duties. "You'll be helping with daily activities, serving meals, and most importantly, providing companionship to our residents." She paused, turning to face him directly. "These are vulnerable people, Mr. Morrison. They deserve respect and dignity." Richard's expression remained neutral, but internally he seethed. He, Richard Morrison, reduced to being a glorified butler for the elderly. His father's words from their last argument echoed in his mind. "You're 50 years old, Richard, and what do you have to show for it? A string of failed marriages, emptied bank accounts, and now this. Maybe this will finally teach you something about responsibility." As they walked past the common area, Richard's attention was caught by an elderly woman sitting by the window. Unlike the other residents who were watching TV or dozing in their chairs, she sat perfectly upright, her white hair neatly styled, reading a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. There was something in her posture, a dignity that seemed to transcend the institutional setting. "That's Rose Thompson," Sarah said, following his gaze. "Former high school English teacher. She's been with us for 3 years. Sarah hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "She can be challenging for some of our staff, very particular about things." Richard watched as Rose turned a page, her movements deliberate and precise. She reminded him of his grandmother, the only person who had ever managed to get through to him before she passed away. He quickly pushed the thought aside. "Your shift starts at 7 a.m. tomorrow," Sarah said, handing him a staff badge and uniform. "Don't be late." That evening, in his luxury apartment overlooking the city, Richard poured himself a glass of sparkling water. Alcohol was strictly forbidden under his probation and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights blurred before him as he confronted the reality of his situation. 6 months. He had to survive 6 months of this humiliation. His phone buzzed with a message from his father. "I hope you're taking this seriously, Richard. It's your last chance." He deleted the message without responding. As he prepared for bed, laying out his uniform for the next day, a far cry from his usual tailored suits, Richard couldn't shake the image of Rose Thompson from his mind. There had been something in her eyes when he passed by. A flash of recognition, perhaps. Or was it judgment? He had seen that look before, in his grandmother's eyes, during their last conversation before she died. "You're better than this, Richard," his grandmother had said. "You have so much to give if you'd only step outside yourself for once." He had dismissed her words then, just as he had dismissed every other attempt to guide him toward a more meaningful life. But now, facing 6 months of forced service, her words returned to haunt him. The next morning arrived with the harsh buzz of his alarm at 5:30 a.m. Richard stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting the uncomfortable polyester uniform. The man staring back at him was a stranger, stripped of his expensive suits and carefully cultivated image of success. He looked ordinary, vulnerable even. As he drove to St. Haven, the rising sun painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that these next 6 months would change him, whether he wanted them to or not. What he didn't know was just how profound that change would be. or that Rose Thompson, the dignified woman with the well-worn book, would play a pivotal role in his transformation. He pulled into the staff parking lot, positioning his Mercedes between two modest sedans, a stark reminder of the world he was being forced to enter. As he walked toward the entrance, he saw Rose again, already awake and sitting in the garden, her face turned toward the rising sun. For a moment, their eyes met, and Richard felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. This wasn't just going to be 6 months of menial labor. It was going to be something far more challenging. Something that would force him to confront not just who he was, but who he had the potential to become. Richard's first week at St. Haven was a brutal awakening. His hands, more accustomed to signing contracts than changing bedsheets, developed blisters. His back, used to ergonomic office chairs, ached from helping residents in and out of wheelchairs. But it was his pride that suffered the most devastating blows. "Mr. Morrison, you missed a spot?" Rose Thompson's clear voice cut through his concentration as he mopped the floor near her favorite window seat. She hadn't spoken to him directly until now, though he'd felt her watchful eyes following him throughout the week. "I've been cleaning for an hour," he muttered, trying to mask his irritation. "The floor is fine." Rose lowered her book. Today it was Pride and Prejudice, and fixed him with a penetrating stare. "Tell me, Mr. Morrison, when you managed your father's company, did you accept mediocre work from your employees?" The question caught him off guard. He hadn't expected her to know who he was, though he supposed his arrival might have been gossip among the residents. "That was different," he said stiffly. "Was it?" Rose adjusted her reading glasses. "Excellence isn't situational. Mr. Morrison, it's a habit. Whether you're running a corporation or mopping a floor, doing it properly matters because it reflects who you are." Richard gripped the mop handle tighter, ready to deliver a sharp retort. But something in Rose's expression stopped him. There was no malice in her eyes, no satisfaction in pointing out his shortcoming. Instead, he saw something that reminded him painfully of his grandmother, a mixture of challenge and belief. "The spot is by your left foot," she said simply, returning to her book. Silently, Richard moved the mop to where she had indicated. Sure enough, there was a subtle smudge he had missed. As he cleaned it properly this time, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction that both annoyed and intrigued him. That evening, during his break, Richard found himself in the staff room, scrolling through his phone when Sarah Chen entered. She seemed surprised to find him there. "Everything all right, Mr. Morrison?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "I noticed you spent quite some time cleaning the East Wing today." "Rose Thompson," he said, not looking up from his phone. "Is she always so particular?" Sarah's laugh was unexpected. "Rose, she's one of our most remarkable residents. Did you know she taught English for over 40 years? She used to be department head at Clayton Prep, one of the most prestigious schools in the state." Richard's head snapped up. "Clayton Prep? I went there." "Really?" Sarah sat down across from him. "When?" "Class of 91, he said, memories flooding back. "I hated English class. Always thought it was a waste of time. Business and math were what mattered." Sarah's expression turned thoughtful. "Rose retired in 90. You just missed her." She paused, stirring her coffee. "You know, she's the reason many of her students went on to become writers, professors, even Nobel laureates. She has a gift for seeing potential in people, especially those who don't see it in themselves." Richard remembered his own English teacher at Clayton, a forgettable replacement who had let him coast through on minimal effort. He wondered briefly how different things might have been if he'd had someone like Rose pushing him to excel. The next few days brought new challenges. Rose seemed to have appointed herself his unofficial supervisor, offering pointed observations about everything from how he arranged the dining room chairs to the way he spoke to other residents. "They're people, Mr. Morrison," she said one morning as he mechanically helped Mr. Jenkins with his breakfast. "Not tasks to be completed." Richard had been about to protest that he was being perfectly efficient, but something in Mr. Jenkins's grateful smile made him pause. He realized he hadn't even asked the elderly man how he was feeling today, something he'd seen other staff members do routinely. It was during his third week that the first real crack appeared in Richard's carefully constructed wall of indifference. He was delivering fresh towels to Rose's room when he noticed a collection of framed photographs on her dresser. One in particular caught his eye, a much younger Rose surrounded by students, all beaming at the camera. "Class of 1985, Rose said from behind him, making him jump. "They threw me a surprise party for my 30th year of teaching." She moved to stand beside him, picking up the photo with gentle hands. Every single one of them went on to do remarkable things, not because they were naturally gifted, but because they learned to believe in themselves. "How?" Richard found himself asking. "How did you make them believe?" Rose set the photo down and turned to face him fully. "By showing them that true worth isn't measured by test scores or bank accounts, Mr. Morrison. It's measured by how we touch the lives of others." She paused, studying his face. "Something your grandmother understood very well." Richard felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. You knew my grandmother." "Margaret Morrison was my dear friend," Rose said softly. "We taught together at Clayton for 15 years. She used to talk about you often, especially after your parents' divorce. She saw such promise in you, Richard, such possibility." The use of his first name, combined with the mention of his grandmother, hit Richard like a physical blow. He mumbled something about needing to finish his rounds and fled the room, his carefully maintained composure crumbling. In his car that evening, Richard sat in the parking lot long after his shift had ended, Rose's words echoing in his mind. He pulled out his phone, and for the first time in years, opened the photos folder he'd labeled Family. There she was, his grandmother, Margaret Morrison, at his college graduation. She was beaming with pride, while he stood stiffly beside her, already planning which bar he'd hit first to celebrate. She had died 3 months later, and he hadn't even made it to her funeral. He'd been too hungover from a weekend in Vegas. His father had never forgiven him for that, and truthfully, neither had he. A tap on his car window startled him. It was Rose, being escorted to the garden for her evening constitutional by one of the nurses. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Richard realized why he'd been so unsettled by her presence from the beginning. She saw him, not the polished facade he presented to the world, but the lost soul beneath, just as his grandmother had. As he finally drove home, the setting sun painting the sky in deep purples and oranges, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the stirring of change, the uncomfortable but insistent pull of growth. Rose Thompson had managed to do what countless therapists, interventions, and even his own father had failed to achieve. She had made him question who he really was, and more importantly, who he could become. But questioning was only the beginning. The real challenge would be facing the answers, and Richard was beginning to realize that his 6 months at St. Haven might not be long enough for the journey ahead. 2 months into his service at St. Haven, Richard found himself facing an unexpected crisis. The morning had started normally enough. He'd arrived early, having finally learned to appreciate the quiet beauty of dawn at the facility. But as he helped serve breakfast, he noticed Rose's absence from her usual window seat. "She had a fall last night," Sarah informed him quietly. "Nothing broken, thankfully, but she's confined to bed rest for a few days." Richard felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. Should I check on her?" Sarah's surprise at his concern was evident, but she nodded. "She's in her room. Just don't tire her out." He found Rose propped up against her pillows, looking smaller and more fragile than he'd ever seen her. Yet her eyes retained their sharp intelligence as she watched him enter. "Ah, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice weaker than usual. "Come to inspect my room for dust?" The attempt at humor didn't mask her discomfort, and Richard found himself moving to adjust her pillows without being asked. "I heard about your fall. Do you need anything?" "Just my dignity back," she sighed. "And perhaps, would you mind reading to me? My eyes are too tired today." Richard picked up the book from her nightstand. "Great Expectations." He settled into the chair beside her bed and began to read, his voice initially stiff and uncomfortable. As the minutes passed, he found himself drawn into the story, his voice taking on the rhythms of the narrative. He was so absorbed that he almost missed the soft knock at the door. It was his father, Hamilton Morrison, standing in the doorway with an expression Richard had never seen before, something between surprise and hope. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "Your director called me," Hamilton said, stepping into the room. "Said you'd been showing real progress. I had to see for myself." His eyes fell on Rose, and recognition flickered across his face. "Mrs. Thompson, is that really you?" "Hello, Hamilton," Rose smiled. "It's been a long time. You look just like your mother now." Richard looked between them, confusion evident. "You know each other?" "Mrs. Thompson was your grandmother's best friend," Hamilton explained. "She used to come to our house for dinner every Sunday when you were very young. Don't you remember?" Richard didn't, and the realization struck him hard. How many meaningful connections had he ignored or forgotten in his relentless pursuit of pleasure and escape? The moment was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Sarah burst in, looking distressed. "Mr. Morrison, Richard, we need your help. Mr. Jenkins is having an episode, and he's asking for you specifically." Richard hesitated, torn between the family reunion unfolding and his duty. Rose's voice, though weak, was clear. "Go, he needs you." He found Mr. Jenkins in the common room, agitated and confused. The elderly man had recently started showing signs of dementia, and today seemed particularly bad. What surprised Richard was how naturally he responded, kneeling beside Mr. Jenkins's wheelchair and speaking softly about their shared morning routines, gradually calming him down. When he returned to Rose's room an hour later, his father was gone, but he'd left a note. "Dinner tonight, we need to talk." "You should go," Rose said, watching him read the note. "Your father is trying." "I don't know if I'm ready," Richard admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "Every time I think I'm changing, I'm terrified I'll disappoint him again." "Fear of failure is natural," Rose said. "But fear of success, that's what truly holds us back. You're not just serving time here, Richard. You're serving your own redemption. Don't run from it." That evening, Richard met his father at their old family restaurant, a quiet Italian place they hadn't visited together in years. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. "I saw you with that elderly gentleman today," Hamilton finally said. "The way you handled him, it reminded me of your mother. She had that same gentle touch with people." Richard stared at his water glass, fighting unexpected emotions. His mother had died when he was 12, and he'd spent years trying to forget the pain of losing her. "I've been horrible to you, Dad," he said suddenly. "To everyone. I've wasted so much time trying to prove I didn't need anyone, trying to show I couldn't be hurt if I didn't care." "Richard," Hamilton's voice was gentle, "you were a child who lost his mother. Instead of helping you grieve, I threw myself into work. Left you with nannies and your grandmother. I failed you first. But I chose to stay broken," Richard said. "Every time someone tried to help, I pushed them away. Even grandmother." "Margaret never gave up on you," Hamilton said. "Neither did I, even when I was at my angriest. And now, seeing you at St. Haven, watching you with Rose and the other residents, son, I'm proud of who you're becoming." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Proud. When was the last time he'd heard that from his father? When was the last time he'd deserved to? But the evening's revelations weren't over. As they finished their meal, Hamilton shared news that would shake Richard's newfound stability. St. Haven was in financial trouble. The facility had 6 months at most before it would be forced to close. "The property developers are already circling," Hamilton said. "They want to turn it into luxury condos." Richard thought of Rose, of Mr. Jenkins, of all the residents who had become more than just obligations to him. The idea of them being displaced, their community shattered, made him feel physically ill. "There has to be something we can do," he said. "Maybe there is," Hamilton replied, studying his son's face carefully. "But it would require someone with business experience, someone who understands both the financial world and the human element, someone who's learned to care. Richard met his father's gaze, understanding the implicit challenge. 2 months ago, he would have dismissed the idea immediately, but now, "I need to talk to Rose," he said, "and Sarah. I need to understand everything about how St. Haven works." As he drove home that night, Richard's mind was racing with possibilities. He had 3 months left of his mandated service, but for the first time, he was thinking beyond that. The residents of St. Haven had given him something he'd been missing his entire adult life: purpose. Now they needed him to step up, to use his skills and connections for something bigger than himself. But as he pulled into his parking garage, his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Come quickly. Rose has taken a turn for the worse." And suddenly, all his plans, all his hopes for redemption seemed to hang by a thread. Because how could he save St. Haven if he couldn't even save the woman who had helped him save himself? Richard burst through the doors of St. Haven, his heart pounding. The night shift nurse directed him to Rose's room, where he found Sarah and a doctor in quiet consultation. Rose lay still in her bed, looking impossibly frail under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Pneumonia," Sarah explained softly. "Her fall weakened her more than we realized. The next 48 hours will be critical." Richard sank into the chair beside Rose's bed, watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest. The steady beep of the heart monitor seemed to mock the precariousness of her condition. "You're not allowed to give up," he whispered, taking her hand. "Not when I'm finally learning to listen." Throughout the night, Richard remained at Rose's bedside, using his phone to research everything he could about St. Haven's financial situation. The more he dug, the more complex the problem became. The facility's troubles weren't just about money. They were about an aging infrastructure, rising healthcare costs, and changing demographics. Dawn found him still there, his jacket draped over the back of the chair, his tie loosened. Rose stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "You look terrible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Richard laughed despite himself. "Even sick, you're still critiquing me?" "Someone has to." She squeezed his hand weakly. "Why are you here, Richard?" "Because I need your help," he admitted. "St. Haven is in trouble. They're going to close it down, turn it into condos. I can't let that happen, but I don't know how to stop it." Rose was quiet for a long moment, her breathing labored. "In my desk," she finally said. "Bottom drawer. There's a red folder." Richard found the folder filled with newspaper clippings, letters, and financial documents dating back decades. As he read through them, a pattern emerged. St. Haven had faced closure before, in the 1980s, but had been saved through an innovative community partnership program. "You were part of this?" he asked, looking up at Rose. She nodded slightly. "We created a model where local businesses invested in the facility in exchange for tax benefits and community goodwill." Her words came in short bursts, each breath an effort. "The program died when the original partners retired or sold their businesses. But it could work again," Richard said, his mind racing. "With some updates, some modern twists." He looked at Rose, excitement building, but found her eyes closed, her breathing more labored than before. The doctor returned, checking Rose's vitals with a concerned expression. "She needs rest," he said firmly. "No more business talk." Richard reluctantly left Rose's room, but his mind was already formulating plans. He called his father, then spent the morning making calls to his old business contacts. Many were surprised to hear from him. His reputation for self-destructive behavior had burned many bridges, but the sincerity in his voice made them listen. By afternoon, he had scheduled a meeting with potential investors for the following week. But as he worked, his thoughts kept returning to Rose's room, where nurses came and went with increasing frequency. "Her oxygen levels are dropping," Sarah informed him during one of his check-ins. "We may need to transfer her to the hospital." The news hit Richard hard. He'd been so focused on saving St. Haven that he hadn't fully processed the possibility of losing Rose. The thought of her dying before seeing him succeed, before knowing if her faith in him was justified, was unbearable. That evening, his father arrived with dinner and a stack of documents. "I've been looking into the legal aspects," Hamilton said. "It's complicated, but not impossible. The real challenge will be convincing the board that your plan is viable." "Why wouldn't it be viable?" Richard asked, spreading out the papers on a table in the common room. "Because of your history," Hamilton said gently. "Your reputation, son, it's going to work against you. They'll see this as another rich boy's whim, not a serious business proposal." The truth of his father's words stung, but Richard knew he was right. His past actions had consequences, and now they threatened to undermine the most important thing he'd ever tried to do. "Then I'll prove them wrong," he said firmly. "I'll show them this isn't about me anymore." A commotion from Rose's room interrupted their discussion. Richard rushed in to find her struggling to breathe, her face pale and drawn. The doctor was already there, ordering oxygen and medications. "Rose," Richard called out, moving to her side, "and hold on, please, I need more time." Her eyes found his, and despite her distress, she managed to mouth two words: "Prove it." The next 24 hours became a blur of activity. While doctors fought to stabilize Rose's condition, Richard worked tirelessly on his proposal to save St. Haven. He interviewed staff, studied the facility's operations, and refined his business plan. The answer, he realized, lay in combining the old with the new. St. Haven's greatest asset wasn't its property value, but its people, both the residents and the staff. Their experiences, their stories, their wisdom were invaluable resources that could be shared with the community in meaningful ways. His plan began to take shape. Partnerships with local schools for intergenerational programs, collaboration with medical schools for geriatric research, and a community engagement initiative that would make St. Haven a hub for senior services beyond just residential care. But as his vision grew clearer and grew, Rose's condition deteriorated. She drifted in and out of consciousness, each awakening briefer than the last. During one lucid moment, she found Richard at her bedside, surrounded by paperwork. "Remember," she whispered, "excellence isn't situational." "I know," he replied, holding back tears. "I'm doing this right, Rose. The way you taught me." She smiled faintly. "No, the way you always could." The next morning, as Richard prepared for his presentation to the board, Sarah rushed to find him. "Rose is asking for you," she said urgently. "You need to come now." Richard looked at his watch. The board meeting was in 30 minutes. Everything he'd worked for, all his plans to save St. Haven, hinged on making that meeting. But one look at Sarah's face told him what mattered more. He pulled out his phone and dialed his father. "Dad, I need you to stall the board. I don't care how. Just give me an hour." Then he ran to Rose's room, where the morning sun was streaming through the window, casting a golden glow on her peaceful face. She was waiting for him, her eyes clear despite her weakness. "The meeting," she managed to say. "Can wait," Richard finished. "Some things are more important." Rose's hand felt light as a feather in Richard's grasp as the morning sun painted her room in shades of gold. Her breathing had steadied somewhat, but her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. "Tell me about your plan," she said. "I want to hear how you're going to save them." Richard leaned forward, his presentation forgotten in his lap. "It's not just about saving the facility, Rose. It's about making it thrive." His voice grew stronger as he explained his vision. "We'll create partnerships with local schools, bringing students to learn from our residents. Their stories, their experiences, they're priceless." A faint smile touched Rose's lips. "Teaching until the end." "There's more," Richard continued, his words tumbling out faster now. "We'll establish a foundation in your name, the Rose Thompson Educational Initiative. It'll fund programs that bridge generations, that make sure the wisdom here isn't lost." Rose's eyes filled with tears. "My legacy?" "No," Richard said firmly. "Your continuation. Everything you taught. About excellence, about seeing the potential in others. It won't end. I promise you that." She squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "Then go, show them." "Rose, I can't leave you. You already know what matters," she interrupted. "Now go, prove it to them." Richard felt the weight of every second as he hurried to the board meeting. His father had managed to delay the start, but the room was tense with impatience when he arrived. The board members, a mix of investors and healthcare administrators, watched him with skeptical eyes. Taking a deep breath, Richard began not with figures or projections, but with a story. "3 months ago, I walked into St. Haven as a punishment," he said. "I was arrogant, empty, caring about nothing but myself. But then I met a teacher who showed me what real value looks like." He told them about Rose, about Mr. Jenkins, about the community that had formed within St. Haven's walls. Then he laid out his plan, not just as a business proposal, but as a vision for what elderly care could become. "We're not just saving a facility," he concluded. "We're preserving a community, creating a model that could transform how we care for our seniors. The choice isn't between profit and compassion. It's about finding ways to achieve both." The questions were tough, probing not just the financial details, but Richard's own commitment. One board member was particularly direct. "Why should we trust you? Your track record is exactly why you should," Richard interrupted. "I know what it's like to be given up on, to be seen as nothing but past mistakes. St. Haven taught me that everyone deserves a chance to show who they can become." His father, sitting quietly in the corner, smiled. The deliberations seemed to last forever. When his phone buzzed with a message from Sarah, Richard's heart nearly stopped. "Come quickly." He looked at the board, still deep in discussion, then at his father. Hamilton nodded slightly, and Richard ran. He found Rose's room filled with soft light and the sound of quiet breathing. Sarah stood by the bed, her eyes wet with tears, but she was smiling. "The fever broke," she said. "She's going to be okay." Richard collapsed into the chair beside Rose's bed, overwhelming relief washing over him. Her eyes fluttered open, finding his face. "Did you show them?" she asked weakly. Before he could answer, his father appeared in the doorway. "They approved it," Hamilton announced quietly. "All of it. The partnerships, the foundation, everything." Rose's smile was radiant despite her weakness. "I knew you could." In the weeks that followed, St. Haven transformed. The Rose Thompson Educational Initiative launched with overwhelming community support. Local schools began sending students to record residents' oral histories. Medical students came to learn not just about geriatric care, but about the human side of aging. Richard found himself working longer hours than he ever had in his previous life. But these hours felt different. They had purpose, meaning. He still served his community service hours as required, but even after they were completed, he stayed on as St. Haven's Director of Community Engagement. 6 months after his presentation to the board, Richard stood in the newly renovated community room, watching Rose teach a group of high school students about literature. She had recovered fully, her voice strong as she guided them through a discussion of To Kill a Mockingbird. "Understanding others," she told them, "is the first step to understanding ourselves." Later, as Richard helped her back to her room, she paused by the window where they had first really spoken. "You know," she said, "your grandmother would be proud of you." "I hope so," Richard replied. "I wish she could see this." "Oh, she does," Rose smiled. "Excellence isn't just about what we achieve, Richard. It's about what we inspire in others. Your grandmother inspired me to never give up on you, and now look what you've inspired here." Richard looked around at the facility, at Mr. Jenkins teaching a young volunteer how to play chess, at the art class where residents and students worked side by side, at the garden where his father was discussing expansion plans with the board. "I had good teachers," he said simply. That evening, as Richard left St. Haven, he stopped to watch the sunset from the garden. His phone buzzed with a text from his father. "Dinner tonight?" "Can't," he replied. "Teaching a business workshop with Rose for the high school entrepreneurship club. Tomorrow." His father's response came quickly. "Wouldn't miss it. Proud of you, son." Richard smiled, thinking of how far he'd come from that first morning when he'd stood in St. Haven's entrance, angry at the world. He had arrived seeking to serve time, but instead he had found purpose. He had come to teach the elderly about dignity, but they had taught him about life. As he walked to his car, he passed Rose's window. She was reading to a young nurse, her voice carrying faintly through the glass, "In every end, there is also a beginning." Richard paused, letting the words sink in. His 6 months of mandated service had ended, but his real journey was just beginning. And for the first time in his life, he couldn't wait to see where it would lead. The sun set behind St. Haven, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Inside, lights began to come on, warm and welcoming against the gathering dusk. Richard thought of all the lives within those walls, lives that would continue to teach, to learn, to grow, because he had learned to see beyond himself. Excellence, he had learned, wasn't about perfection, it was about purpose, and in finding his purpose, Richard Morrison had finally found himself. What would you do if life gave you an unexpected second chance? Has someone ever believed in you when you didn't believe in yourself? Sometimes the most profound changes in our lives come from the most unexpected places. When have you experienced a moment that transformed your perspective forever? We'd love to hear your story. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this journey touched your heart, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to join our community. Your support keeps these powerful stories coming every day, touching lives and reminding us that transformation is always possible. And if you're ready for another moving journey that will touch your soul just as deeply, click the video appearing on your left. Trust us, it's a story that will stay with you long after it ends. Remember, every ending can be a new beginning. See you in the next story.